This is a Cold War map. All the dots are where the Russians had their military bases. During the Cold War, Canada was in a privileged position. Now, the United States had created globalization in order to build an alliance to fight the Soviets. And whenever we tried to get a trade relationship with other countries, we always had to give in a little bit because we got full security control as a result. So that was the guns for butter trade that defined the Cold War and American strategic policy. Now, Canada, because it's on the flight path for the missiles from the Soviet Union to the United States, could have been a security free rider. You could have been neutral. To your credit, you chose not to. In fact, to your credit, the Canadians were always the first ones for any fight. If they saw a crisis in the world, they'd pick up the phone, they'd call the president, and the first words the Canadian Prime Minister always said is, "We see what's happening, we're here, how can we help?" And that made Canada our fastest friend. But you weren't dumb about it. The next words out of the Canadians' mouth after all the security details were worked out, be like, "We would really appreciate a little bit more market access for Quebecois cheese or Ontarian spark plugs," or whatever it happened to be, softwood timber, if you will. On over 70 different occasions, Canada carved little melon scoop exceptions out of American trade law, and all of those were folded into Nafta 1. And that's how things lasted. Until this guy came along. We've been moving away from the globalist approach in the United States for some time, but Donald Trump was the first one to make it the centerpiece of his foreign policy. And he loved Trudeau because Trudeau was perceived around the world as the only world leader that Donald Trump was smarter than. With that in his back pocket, Trump played hardball on trade negotiations, and all of those exemptions that Canada had spent 40 years building into American trade law were jettisoned in the Nafta 2 discussions. The only reason that there's even an adjudication function in there isn't because of Canada, it's because Nancy Pelosi put it in at the last second within the US House. Now, as we all know, Justin Trudeau is not the brainchild that is running Canada. That would be Christina Freeland. And at the time that Trump was became president, she was your trade negotiator and ultimately your foreign minister. And she attempted to play the old playbook in the NAFTA negotiations, the idea that Canada has a special place in American trade law and it's justified in getting its exemptions. And I'm not saying this to denigrate her. I think she's one of the smartest people on the planet right now. But her first week on the job was Trump's first week on the job. And she was handed a playbook that became obsolete the day she took her office. And so she was pushing for things into NAFTA 2 that the United States had no interest in, on labor, on environmental regulations. And at the end of the day, the Americans got sick of it and cut a bilateral deal with the Mexicans to cut Canada out of NAFTA completely. And this is the photo from the stage when she found out. The Mexican and the American negotiators didn't tell her ahead of time. And after this meeting, she was simply told, the United States is going to proceed with this in 8 days with the Mexicans. You have 8 days to accept the original terms. If you don't, fine, you're on your own. Mexico isn't unskilled. They haven't been unskilled for 20 years. They're semi-skilled. They're good at moving around pieces of metal. They're good at anything that requires eyes and hands that can't necessarily be automated, but they're even good at some types of automation. Canada and the United States are both good at the high end. We both do design. We both do high-end assembly systems. We both do intellectual work. We both do high-end wiring. And so there's always this built-in tension between the United States and Canada. The way it's worked to this point is each Canadian province has integrated more south than they have laterally. So for all intents and purposes in manufacturing, Ontario and Quebec and BC are American states in terms of manufacturing, and you're part of the milieu. But as Canada has aged demographically and the United States has not, or at least not as much, you're not going up the value-added scale anymore, but your labor is becoming more expensive. And perhaps some regulations are on top of that, complicating the issue. And that makes it very difficult for Canada to compete with the United States. Now, if Canada was on the other side of Mexico, you could benefit from Mexico in the same way that we can. But you're not. You're forced to try to integrate south And in the case of Ontario, your best partner is Michigan and Ohio. Automotive, that works really well. But in the case of Quebec, it's aerospace. And the United States has some very pathologically formed opinions on aerospace. And one of the things we're going to see in the next couple of years is Airbus is going to go away. They get their aluminum from Russia. They get their titanium from Russia. And they get their engines and their wings from Britain. And Britain is applying for a free trade agreement with the United States, and we've made it very clear that one of the conditions is you join the Boeing family instead of the Airbus family. And so all of a sudden, Bombardier has to make some very, very hard decisions about their future. A lot of this is wrapped up in what Donald Trump did in Nafta too. It has foreseen a series of uncomfortable decisions on Canadian business about how to operate in an environment where the global structures are no longer there, and it really needs to focus on the United States and Mexico. As almost any country in the world will tell you, the most uncomfortable place is to be number 1 or number 2 on the United States' worry list. Until now, Canada's been like number 20 or number 25, and that's allowed Canada to ignore and avoid a lot of the scrutiny that comes in from when the Americans feel paranoid about something. We're not in that world anymore. As American interests shrink back to North America, all of a sudden Canada is going to consistently make the top 5 list. That's not a great place to be.
What are the opportunities that you see for Canada? And I guess more broadly, what does the future of the North American trade bloc look like to you?
Let's start with the punchline. North America is going to be the fastest growing economic bloc of size in the world for at least the next 30 years. And Mexico specifically is going to be one of the top 2 growth stories for that same time frame. So from my point of view, the hard work for the 3 countries has already been done. The intellectual infrastructure is in place. The trade deal has been ratified and implemented. We've already tested the adjudication mechanisms. They work. I feel very good about the long-term prognosis. The challenge is going to be that doubling of the industrial plants in the next 5 years as Germany and China go away. Mexico has already hit the ground running, and as of the 3 Amigos Summit, which just concluded today, all 3 countries are trying to figure out how they can move more and more of the semiconductors and electronic supply chain into North America, which is great. The problem for Canada is it's not clear that they can directly benefit from a lot of that. Canada does not have the green space or the population density or the availability of labor in its major cities to do a semiconductor build-out. And a successful electronics manufacturing sector requires different skill sets at different price points. And Mexico is perfect for the United States for that because we've got the high-skilled labor right on the border with their mid-skilled labor. They can interact very, very easily. Canada is also high-skilled labor at the same price point. So the Mexican labor system in this sector is very complementary to U.S. labor. The Canadian system would be competitive, and the only way that Canada could exist in that space if they do the high value-added stuff and ferry the intermediate products to Mexico via air. There are sectors where that model works, cell phones, for example. But for run-of-the-mill semiconductors, no. And Canada does not have a domestic semiconductor skill set that is up high. So the sort of sectors that we face the biggest vulnerability in as a continent: electronics, computing, cellular. That takes a lot of skilled labor. And Canada has a shortage of labor. So for Canada to pull this out of the fire, they need those 500,000 people a year. And they have to have them be here, and they need homes.
Awesome.
You already have a better social welfare system. You already have a better healthcare system the United States does. Not that that's a high bar, but it does make it easier to integrate people from different backgrounds. You need to do more of that in more parts of the country as quickly as possible. And that means encouraging people to live somewhere other than just the gateway cities, so you can make this as broad-based and sustainable as you possibly can. And if you can pull that off, Canada will be an inseparable part of the North American experience, and it will enjoy years of the fastest economic growth in its entire history. And so will Mexico, and so will the United States. Ultimately, this is a really good story, but we're all going to have to do some uncomfortable things in order to get there. But when I look at the economic potential of Canada, the manufacturing possibilities for Quebec and Ontario, we've already kind of dealt with. I think there's a very strong case there, but of course people are going to be moving to the city. But Canada is renowned for exporting unprocessed commodities, whether it's mining or agriculture. If all you did is do a little bit of processing and some value added in your secondary cities, particularly in the prairies, the jobs that would come up from that would be beyond lucrative and should prove sufficient to draw people from international. If you're looking for an example in the States, look at the state of Iowa. It's not the most exciting place to live, but it's really the only American state that has kind of invested in going up the value-added chain, not just from plant agriculture to animal agriculture, but the processing in order to do the soy crushing and make the oils and make the flour, whatever it happens to be, to send out a value-added product instead of just the raw